Okay,
Right, okay, carry on.
got it. Yes, okay. I guess we should give the usual New Year greetings from CLS. We really appreciate you come to our meetings. If it's your first time, please keep coming back and seeing what we get up to. And somebody's got the yes, they're on. Yeah. Okay. Um, yes, the order of play today is going to be Ozzy reporting a bit from Trinidad. Um, our executive member in Trinidad will do a little report on what's happening in Trinidad at the moment. And then we will have Professor Emily Morris will tell us about Cuba. And then hopefully Jeremy Corbyn will be on to update us on reparations and what's happening in his last trip in Jamaica. So yes, so without much ado, we'll start with inviting Ozzy to take the floor.
Yes, and of course, yes, thank you very much, and good afternoon to everyone, or good evening, depending on your time zone. Yeah, I'm I'm going to give a very short report on some recent developments in Trinidad and Tobago, where the government recently, about a week ago, has declared a state of emergency. Now, what triggered the government to declare a state of emergency at this time? Well, it started, the trigger that is, on the 28th of December, when Trevor Williams was shot and killed right outside a police station. What was disturbing about that particular killing is that the men who killed him were actually waiting in a panel van obliquely opposite the police station. So that raises all sorts of red flags. When he was killed, and he was killed because a number of persons were leaving the police station. In Trinidad and Tobago, when you have certain charges and you're out on bail, you have these conditions where you have to go into the police station to sign a book. So many persons involved in gangs, they do that on a regular basis. So that is what transpired. He was not the exact target. It was a particular gang leader was the target. But what happened is the following day, 5 men were killed in one go in a shop in Laventil, 5 at one time, which would have been the Sunday. So he was killed this Saturday. These 5 guys were killed on the Sunday. And then the Monday morning is when they declared a state of emergency. But what is a bit disturbing is that the day after, this is Olier's day now, the day after they have declared a state of emergency, and I'll explain a little bit what that means. A state prosecutor he went to church with his family. This is Olier's night, a Seventh-day Adventist. And when he was returning to his car, he was shot and killed. And he's a state prosecutor. And then just a few days ago, on the 3rd of January, this is also still within the state of emergency, you had a schoolboy, 15 years, was killed in Tobago, which is the smaller of the Twin Island Republic. When Randall Hector, that is the state prosecutor, was killed, it brought the murder rate to an unprecedented 625 murders in the year. So, of course, you can imagine in a small island republic, that is an extremely high figure, extremely high figure. We've never reached that figure in our history. This is the highest murder rates we've ever had. It is clear that crime has gotten completely out of control now. And we've seen the rise of gangs. Sort of embryonic stages of the rise of the gangs in Haiti and even in Jamaica, as we see. Now, just 2 days ago, of course, there's massive public outcry in terms of the fear, the insecurity. The Prime Minister announced that he will not be going back up for elections and that he will resign as political leader What we don't know as yet is whether he will attempt to resign as prime minister prior to the actual elections. And based on our parliamentary system, whoever commands the majority in the parliament could become the next prime minister, right? I think that you all had that with, could be Theresa May, I think. I can't recall. So that is a possibility. So that now changed the whole political dynamics in Trinidad and Tobago. But the issue of this, the crime really was the burning issue. And it was clear to him that they are going to lose the 2025 elections on several issues, but the crime issue was going to be one of the biggest ones, the biggest issue that they were going to lose the elections. And so his strategy is a kind of Biden strategy. Step down because he's become very, very unpopular. People place the responsibility of the high level of crime on his feet. So that's a political strategy that the government is going to attempt to try. Now, as I close off, the question is why? How did we reach to this? This is what happens when governments aggressively implement neoliberal policies. And we, as a trade union movement in Trinidad and Tobago, for almost 2 years have been saying crime will become an increasing burden on the society if they continue with their economic policies. So said, so done. In fact, we joined with what became known as the People's Roundtable, which is a platform of civil society and trade unions. We held a crime summit earlier this year in January, a full crime summit. And we outlined that in that crime summit, and coming out of the crime summit, a report that suggests that government economic policies, the inequality that is created, the marginalization that is created, especially for young men, that has to be fixed if we are to deal with the crime situation. And that was at the beginning of the year. Little did we know that we would have ended up with a 625 murder toll at the end of 2024. That report would have been submitted to the government and submitted to different members of parliaments to say, listen, the path that Trinidad and Tobago is on is going to lead to extreme despair and destruction. We said that, we predicted that. And therefore, what we saw at the end of 2024 was a bloodbath, a massacre, and the end result is a society that is now living in fear. What does the state of emergency mean? It gives the regulations, speaks to increasing police power. It doesn't include a curfew, and neither does it include the restriction of having assemblies and meetings. We will have to test it as trade unionists because we have a series of protests lined up that we had planned for this month, coming out of last month's demonstration. And so we are going to have to test that to see if that is indeed so. But what we do have is increased police powers, the power to arrest, the powers to enter your home, and as well the inclusion of the army. That is the defense force. So basically the coercive arm of the state has been given extra powers in this context. And so that is where we are at the moment. It is a very frightening situation. Not so, the crime is one thing, but you also have to be very afraid of the state itself when it gives that amount of power and authority to the coercive arm. So, for those of us who are involved in struggle, it's really a dicey situation. And then with the prime minister declaring that he will no longer be going up for elections and that he's going to resign as political leader, creates a little bit of political instability. So that's where we are. Thank you for the opportunity to give that short report. And I could, if there are any questions, I can field a few. You're muted. You're muted, comrade.
Thank you. Thanks for that, Ozzy. Maybe we'll have a question or so. I see one handed up. Dr. Liz. Now, I'm always suspicious whenever there's these states of emergencies and so on declared, especially when workers seem to be getting militant. And we know there's been a series of protests in Trinidad. Yeah. I think there's a pattern that runs really through many countries, state of emergency is a way of stifling popular protests. We've seen it in other islands as well. Okay, we got two hands. Okay, Liz, can we hear from you? Can you take the
Solidarity,
floor?
comrades. Solidarity, comrades. Thank you so much, Ozzy. You feel very familiar. I don't know why we've met before, but I feel we've met each other before, Ozzy. I don't know if it's been on this platform, but anyway, so brother, comrade. As a trade unionist, I was intrigued or interested in the mass strikes earlier this year, including the ground staff and the airline staff. I'm wondering, are the prohibitive civil order restrictions, the what do you call it, state of emergency, is that related, do you think, to the upturn in trade union activity? And secondly, when you say neoliberal as a government, we're very restricted in Britain, and we only understand American politics and British politics. So when it comes to the Caribbean, I'm often confused as to what is a Labour Party and what is a Social Democratic Party, etc. So what would you describe the current political party is, and what is it that you're saying as being the cause for the political strife, which you're saying is also leading to an increase in the crime rate? Is it more of a conservative Tory right-wing neoliberalism, or is it a social democratic sort of liberal Labour Party type?
Okay.
This Labour Party, not this Labour Party that we currently have in Britain, because that was my concern when we had the riots in the summer, that they were using the arm of the law to control the people and to also send a message to us on the left that we're going to be stricter on you. Because when you do that sort of thing, you might be trying to lock up far right, but there was far more Black and Asian people with harsher sentences during those riots.
Okay, thank you, Liz. I think, Ozzy, those are the questions there for you, but I'm afraid your time is quite limited in this. And we've got Paul waiting for to ask a question. That'll be the final question before we introduce the next speaker. Okay, you want to respond, Ozzy?
No, I'll hear Paul, and then I'll just make a quick response to both, and so that it's shorter.
Okay, thanks for your report, Ozzy. As people probably know, Jamaica's been in a similar situation for some years now, with continuous states of emergency in parts of the country, which the opposition have challenged in courts, just to use them as a regular policing method. They don't seem to have much effect, because the murder rate in Jamaica last year was twice, 2024, twice what you had in Trinidad, like 1,1300. So states of emergency clearly not working. We have been trying a thing called Zozo, which is a state of emergency along with some kind of social building, but the finances for that social building are never enough. So it really doesn't amount to very much. But it does worry me that, as in Trinidad, in most of the Caribbean, there's a massive increase in tourism activity, lots and lots of hotels being built, and yet people still not, the crime's still high. And the only encouragement I can get from it is at the end of last year, the hotel workers in Jamaica finally took action, because they get very overworked and underpaid. And along with the BPO workers who are in a similar situation, there's a possible fight back. But in the meantime, we have the same crime problem right across the Caribbean, of course. It's not just Trinidad and Tobago and Jamaica. Thanks, Ozzy.
Yeah, but very quickly, so to answer Dr. Inobong, Liz, yes, the current administration is very on the right side. They're politically right-wing, and it's sort of implementing that sort of Thatcherism type of policies. And yes, it's also the state of emergency, we believe, is a response to trade union activism. In fact, on the 16th of December, after our major demonstration on the 7th of December, supported by CLS And I always like to thank CLS for their support and solidarity, being outside the High Commission of Trinidad and Tobago in London. That was amazing. So that they, on the 16th, just a week after that, the electricity workers, the electricity company went and got an injunction against the union and the workers. But what is worse is they filed a contempt of court, that we are in contempt of a court order, and that they have applied. And they have applied for what is called an order of committal. That is basically the arrest of the trade union of our executive, which myself. Just Friday, I was served with the court order on Friday. So you know, the intensity of the struggle is getting more and more. It's increasing, but we are prepared to continue the fight. State of emergency or no state of emergency, injunction or no injunction, arrest or no arrest. We will continue our bitter struggle against this neoliberal right-wing government. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. I think you answered those questions there. Now, we should invite our first speaker up. Professor Emily Morris, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Yeah, and I'm doctor. I'm not yet professor.
All right, you can always force things along here, you know. It's okay. Thank you so much.
Okay, so shall I just begin then straight away?
Yes, please. Please take the
Okay,
floor.
well, I think in the case of Cuba, if anybody's been watching the news, you will know that the situation is very, very difficult at the moment. And you have heard about all the power cuts. There's been a complete breakdown of the whole grid at one point in October. There are frequent power cuts. There are scheduled and unscheduled power cuts. And there are shortages, including of medicine. And actually, the mortality rates have gone up. So their world famous health service is under huge strain. And real incomes have fallen dramatically because inflation took off in 2021 and it remains high at about 30% a year at the moment. And so there are shortages all around and there are queues and it's very difficult for people in their everyday life. Transport is in a terrible state and so on. And you may have also seen that emigration has accelerated dramatically in the last few years. And they've lost around, well, more than 1 million people out of a population of 11 million. And that includes a lot of young people and a lot of people with the skills. And so there are severe shortages in some critical areas, but also it has a strong psychological effect. It's splitting up families and so on. And there's also, so in a way, this is the next crisis after the special period of the 1990s. Like then, there's been an increase in black markets. There's an increase in inequality, and it seems to be more inequality than there was before. There's a lot of commentary on that. And there's also more crime than before, although it's on nothing like the scale of the rest of the Caribbean. But for Cubans, it's a big shock. And there's that's the word on the street, is crime is climbing up. And so you have, so that's what you hear in the foreign press. Then you also have social media, which is awash with anti-government, with complaints and with anti-government propaganda. And then you also have external economists who say, this just shows that, socialism doesn't work, that Cuba's going down the pan because it's a, non-functional economy. And it has to be said that the public mood is affected by these things because they're on social media and because, during a deep recession like what you've got now, you're going to have people who are disillusioned and so on. So there is a kind of, more than I've seen before, particularly among young people who are most affected by the social media, a kind of dismissal of what the government is saying about this being caused by US sanctions or the blockade, because they've heard it for so long, they've heard it all their lives, and they just don't want to hear it anymore. And so there is a kind of a diminishing strength of support for the government, put it that way. Some people just leaving, some people disengaging, a lot of young people disengaging from any sort of official sponsored activity and so on, and a lot of people moving out of the formal sector into the informal sector. where you can earn a lot more than if you have a state salary. And there's a growing private sector, with small businesses, small and medium businesses, which were legalized in 2021. And they kind of around them in that ecosystem, there's a lot of informal activity. So there's a lot of people who are earning quite a lot, and then an awful lot of people, particularly the vulnerable, particularly the old, who are really up against it. The state is still providing, of course, very basic needs, but they're very, very basic. So you're back to kind of survival as before. So I was there in November, for the month of November. And so I just give you a few of my observations when I was there. I was there actually when there were some power cuts, and there were scheduled power cuts, and everybody's coping with those very well. You know that you're going to have 6 hours off, and then you just prepare for it. There was also a hurricane while I was there, and so the electricity was off for 3 days where I was, which was actually remarkably good because it's the Category 3 hit Havana, and I saw all the trees come down, bringing down the power lines, and they moved incredibly fast to put everything back up again. And also there was a sudden breakdown, an unscheduled breakdown. It went off at 2 o'clock in the morning. And I suppose the feeling was after the experience of October, when it took ages to get the power back up again, because, you know, one thing had a knock-on effect on other things, you know, people were thinking, God, is this it? Have we kind of lost power now? But actually the power was back up again in 12 hours, which was impressive. And it also shows that the changes that they've made in the way that they manage the grid have actually brought benefits. So there was a kind of a moment there in November where people were thinking, you know, how bad can it get? How bad is it going to get? But I think I kind of got the sense when the electricity came back on, it was huge relief. So that the mood among the young, that disengagement is definitely true. There are people who are complaining, who say they never complained before, but I think they probably did anyway. And then among the economists there, you know, the economists tend to be on the kind of liberal side of things, the non-government economists. They're kind of impatient for some reforms that they think that need to be made. They're criticizing the government for ineptitude or partial reforms or attempting to control things that they can't control and then leading to more black markets and so on. But they, at least the economists within Cuba, acknowledge the impact of the US sanctions. You know, they do acknowledge that that is actually the main cause of all the problems. And then I also spoke to some officials, and it's interesting talking to them because basically what they will do is they'll emphasize the constraints, but they don't just, it's not just a rhetorical, you know, the blockade does all of this. It's specifying how difficult it has been for them since Cuba was put on the state sponsors of terrorism list in 2021 to actually import anything. So the prices of basic goods, fuel and food went right up. They increased by 40% in 2018. And at the same time, obviously during COVID, they had to spend a vast amount of money on their health service, did incredibly well in 2020, but they used up international reserves. And then in 2021, things got even worse. The prices of oil and food even got higher. The supplies got more interrupted. The impact of the state sponsors of terrorism got worse. And so by 2021, Cuba was facing, without any reserves, without any access to international finance, which is totally unusual and no other country faces that, they face this, you know, a huge recession without the possibility of picking up. And I'll just talk about that in a minute. But just to emphasize that the numbers, the foreign exchange income has fallen by 30%. At the same time as the fuel price has risen by 40%. Cuba spends half of its total foreign exchange on fuel and food. Basic food to feed the ration system to make sure that everybody has enough. They continue to have a commitment to health and basic needs, and therefore they have no fiscal space. So they had a huge inflation. They have no other tools to use, no finance to use, except to try to rein in the money supply, which means that they've got no capacity to increase government spending. So it's the government services that have been hit hardest, those precious government services. So for example, energy consumption, total energy consumption, I was having a look, had gone down by 40%. So the national income's gone down by about 10%, and energy consumption has gone down by 40%. They're really struggling keeping the lights on. And because the oil price has gone up so much and the foreign exchange has gone down, that means that spending on everything else, that includes spare parts, inputs, everything, has gone down even more dramatically. So I think even what the economists don't understand, but what the people on the streets certainly don't understand clearly enough, is the financial constraints that the government is under. So there is no space. So what the government's had to do is had to centralize control of foreign exchange in order to buy the essential goods. That means that if you're in a state enterprise is actually making profits, a large part of that profit gets sequestered effectively by the central bank in order to pay for basic goods. So that means that even if you're an exporter, you're not able to invest. So investment spending has gone right down. And so picking up from this recession is very, very difficult. So they're flatlining at the moment. In any other country in the whole world, there would be access to finance of various sorts, but that's precluded pretty much by state-sponsored terrorism listing, as well as all of the other restrictions imposed by Trump. So the psychological effect of the opening to Obama, then the Trump administration, and then even worse, the Biden administration not relaxing the severe constraints that the previous Trump administration had put on. The psychological effect has been really powerful, particularly on the generation just reaching adulthood now. So the government is really struggling. That's what I discovered. And I think that the public debate fails to understand the lack of space that the government has to do anything but just survive at the moment. And so then the criticism from the economists, the economists who are loyal but critical within Cuba, and they say, yeah, but they should be communicating better. And you look at the press, you look at the statements by the government, and they are actually explaining things. The data's not very good. That's partly because they haven't got enough money to collect all the data, but they are trying to explain, but they're actually facing this onslaught, which is financed substantially by the US, which they perfectly openly admit. This onslaught of propaganda, which means that whatever they say will be used against them. So sometimes people say you're not a good communicator, but if you've got people shouting, giving different messages, then it's very difficult to communicate your side of the story, if you like. There's also criticism that the government doesn't appear to be aware of how severe the problems that everyday people are suffering. How severe are those problems? And there's kind of this impression, and I think it's given by the fact that the president himself is slightly overweight, middle-aged white man, and a lot of his ministers are. And so you have these pictures of these rather large, they're not hugely overweight, but group of people who are going around the country and talking to people, and the people they're talking to tend to not look as well fed as they do, let's put it that way. And so it looks like they're distant, but actually what they've been doing, and what Diaz-Canel, the president, has been doing, is going around the country, tirelessly going around the country, talking to people at local level about their problems, what they can do. And he's put all the emphasis on decentralization to the municipal level, local control, participation, and innovation. That is bringing science and all of the investment that they've done for years to try to work out how Cuba can use its own resources, which are very much human resources, in order to pull out this, because there are no other financial resources coming from anywhere else. And we can talk about that, China, Russia, and so on, but it's very, very little that's available to them. So that's all the emphasis. And so they're going around everywhere and talking about the problems that they face, the local problems, what they can do, what the priorities, and so on. Who are the most vulnerable? How can they reach them? And so that is different from the 1990s, when they had the special period when Fidel convened workers' parliaments, where they had parliaments all over the country. And so people now are saying, well, why haven't we got workers' parliaments? And I think, in a way, what Diaz-Canel is doing is probably more appropriate for the current circumstances, because of because it's less centralized economy, and because trying to engage people through official organizations, which is what they did before, is more difficult because, you know, not everybody is involved in state employment like they were before. So in some ways, it's a more appropriate policy, and that they certainly try to communicate it, but it's not, the message isn't getting through to a large extent. It's not, you know, universal. But so in conclusion, and I want to talk briefly because I'd like to have a discussion. I think, you know, looking at the numbers, you can see very clearly the cause of the crisis is US sanctions. It's US sanctions combined with US propaganda. I don't know if you remember about that nonsense about the sonic attacks, which as soon as the Trump administration got in, they pretty much reversed the diplomatic opening that Obama had done last time. And by just saying that there were these mysterious sonic attacks and people were being attacked, and they weren't being attacked, and it was completely made up. And there have been a series of made up stories like trafficking in doctors, some story about the Chinese having a listening station. These are completely fabricated, but they're enough to create a kind of sense that Cuba is a hostile place. And so from being the most trendy, popular destination for young people to go to during the Obama administration, tourism has gone right down. And one of the effects of the sanctions is that if you go to Cuba, you can't then get a US, an ESTA visa waiver to go to the US. And so people from Europe realizing that think, well, I don't want to be barred from ever going to the US. And so they choose somewhere else in the Caribbean to go. So what they're facing now, I was there when the result of the US election came in. And what was interesting is, you know, there was no sense of panic. It was just like, well, you know, Biden wasn't much better. I mean, he wasn't at all better, really. He left everything in place that Trump had introduced. But Trump, with Marco Rubio and Mauricio Clavacaroni now in important positions, well, Marco Rubio, obviously, as Secretary of State, they've said that they want to increase pressure on third countries, increase the implementation of existing sanctions, squeeze remittances, you know, so they're gearing up to doing everything they can possibly do to make it even worse. It's hard to imagine how it could get worse, to be honest, but I said that last time, and you know, they did manage to. So they're very creative, they're very determined, those people. We know that Trump doesn't have any particular feeling about Cuba one way or the other, but he's appointed Marco Rubio, so he's giving him a free rein to do what he likes. So Cuba, the Cubans who are remaining in Cuba, and there is a lot of determination to remain and to preserve their sovereignty, they're just going to have to manage, you know, and so they've managed until now. They are using the resources that they've got, and yes, they are very concerned to develop and cultivate relations with other countries that don't follow the US line. I think the support, you know, historically of the Caribbean has been really important. And actually, when Obama finally switched to realizing that he couldn't sustain the sanctions anymore, it was partly because of his isolation within the Latin American and Caribbean region at that time. So I do think it's important, even though the US will be throwing its diplomatic and its economic weight around like anything. There's a growing awareness, a lot of articles now about the how economic sanctions, which are being used more and more by the US all over the world, but of course Cuba having suffered more than most. Economic sanctions hurt mostly the vulnerable and the poor, and they kill people. It's a silent killer. And it's very much the case in Cuba, particularly as it's particularly aimed at the state, and it's a state that provides the food, the basic food and the medical care that the Cubans rely on. So I think, I mean, I'm going to leave it there. I think Cuba's facing a huge challenge, and it's not, you know, it's important beyond Cuba, because what it is a classic example of how the US can use its political and economic might to try to destroy any experiment that he doesn't approve of. And so, you know, the Cubans are standing firm. They're trying to cope with it, and quite creatively. The process of economic reform, you know, adjustment or adaptation is continuing, despite what people say. They're still trying to restructure the economy so that it's more diversified, so that they can find more markets, so that they can replace imports and so on. Big push towards renewable energy, which is quite marked under the circumstances. And in that, the Chinese have obviously been important, but the Chinese aren't generous, not like the Soviet Union. And the Russians, nor are the Russians. You know, they've got good relations with both countries and with Vietnam and with a lot of other countries, but they're not providing the money that the Cubans so desperately need. Okay, I'm going to leave it there. I hope that gives a kind of springboard for some questions.
Thank you very much, Emily. That's so powerful, especially the explanation about the economic situation, how it is. You know, what concerns us greatly is the political situation. It's just so immoral the way the US has been treating Cuba for this last 60-odd years. And when you consider they're arming a state that is committing genocide by almost every standards that people have used. And they continue to do that. You know, Cuba has only ever reached out the countries to help and support them, whether with doctors, education, and other types of support, you know, we're having during the COVID crisis and so on. So we're appalled. What I think is how can we get more pressure on the Caribbean governments to do more? And we certainly will discuss within CLS. We're in touch with Cuba Solidarity Organization. I actually invited Bob to this meeting. I don't know if he's on it. But yes, a lot more needs to be done in terms of raising awareness about Cuba and trying to put pressure on the CARICOM governments to do more. Maybe a flotilla of boats taking food to Cuba or something to openly demonstrate that they're not going to have this double standards continue. We'll discuss more. Okay, we got a couple of hands. I'll take Kevin Nelson is up there first. Hi, Kevin. If we'll take you to put your question.
Thanks, Luke.
The floor.
I'd just like to come in where Emily ended on the international dimension of development. We've seen in the response to the recent energy crisis substantial external aid to Cuba from Russia and China in particular. And this included quite complex energy equipment and parts and technical aid. And my question to Emily is, what is the potential for more large-scale development initiatives in sectors like energy, infrastructure, other economic sectors, along the lines that we see in Central and South America and the Caribbean as well, as part of China's Road and Belt Initiative? Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, Kevin. With one other question up, we'll take two at a time. Liz, you want to come in with your question?
Yes, thank you. I'll be quicker this time. Yes, my first question is, what about solar energy in Cuba? I know getting batteries and panels and things is quite difficult anywhere in the world, quite expensive, but is solar energy something that they rely on or can use? And quickly, secondly, that happened when we went to Russia, that you wouldn't want your passport stamped with a Russian visa, because then if in the future you got a job in America or wanted to travel to America, they would restrict you traveling there. So what is their hope for the relationship with Mexico, that's a neighbour, with the new more left-wing government? And what is your role, Emily? You're doctor of what? Thank you.
Okay, I'll answer those. Yeah, I'll answer those. I'll start with the last question, just to explain myself. Yeah, so I'm a development economist and I specialize in Latin America and the Caribbean, but now particularly on Cuba. What I'm also doing is I've set up a community interest company. We do research collaboration with the Caribbean, but particularly with Cuba. So we're doing university to university links. Now that brings us to the second one of your other questions, which is on solar energy. Cuba's making a big push towards it. Now I did do an interview a year or so ago, a couple of years ago actually, at the Ministry of Energy. And the man actually showed me a slide of how many contracts they had in the pipeline for developing solar parks when Trump came in, and they were all cancelled. So foreign investors pulled out because of what they saw. Since then, they've been working very, very hard, and they have worked with the Chinese. So this year, they're actually doubling their solar electricity generating capacity, I think this year and last. But that's just doubling from 5% to 10% of the total. So the rest is all fossil fuels, and 2/3 of fossil fuels are imported. So it's a really urgent thing for them to do. So it's urgent for them both because they're committed to mitigating climate change, but also because for them economically, it's really important. So they're pushing as hard as they can, but without finance, it's a very difficult thing to do. So they're working with the Chinese. The trouble with working with the Chinese, and this comes to the other question, which is about foreigners investing in energy and infrastructure. Okay, so the Cubans, they have very little grant funding from outside. So they don't have any access to any of the development banks, or they have bilateral assistance from some countries, and they have loan finance, or they have investors. Now, the trouble is, because they have no access to international finance, whenever they hit a crisis, one of the first things they do is they stop payments to creditors because they're using the money instead for urgent things. And therefore, they have a very, very bad payments record. And with a very bad payments record, then you can't borrow more money. And they even owe a lot of money to China. So China's a bit reticent to lend money, but it's very much politically on side in terms of reaching out, giving assistance when they have a hurricane and so on. They've had aid from China and from Russia, which is significant, but it's nothing compared to what they've lost in terms of foreign exchange earnings. So it can't fill the gap, but it's very important as a symbol of solidarity. And I think that comes to what can we do about it? I think very much raising the profile, making people more aware of the outrage of sanctions and what they do to the poorest. It's the old people, it's the sick people who are dying in Cuba.
Oops. Can you help me to put the...
Yeah, sorry, have I gone too long? Yeah, so, passport stamp, very briefly. Yeah, the Cubans they're not stamping passports, but when you fill in an ESTA form, you have to fill in a question that says, have you traveled to the following countries? And Cuba's one of them. So if you lie on your ESTA form and you're found out, then you're committing a very serious act. And so for most people, that's enough to put them off trying to go to Cuba, even though nobody would find out. And there are different periods in the history since I've been covering Cuba for the last 30 years, where the implementation of the existing sanctions is stronger or weaker. And it was quite interesting during the period when Obama was having secret talks. Nobody got fined for violating the travel restrictions. But then at other stages, they start trying to make an example of people. So that's how it is. So you can go there and you can get, your passport not stamped, but it's enough to put people off from Europe, and it's enough to put off, obviously, travel companies. So the potential for larger scale, I think, in a way, the more that the US alienates China, the more Chinese will have a political interest in deepening their relationship with Cuba, which is obviously completely contrary to what the US is trying to achieve. So there are a lot of contradictions actually in US policy, because one of the things they want to do is stop remittances, which are a very important part of people's living now, much more than they were in the special period. But of course, that means restricting the rights of US citizens to send the money that they want to send. And so then they get a backlash over there. So even among the Cuban American community. So, we don't really know how far they can go in the US because there are these contradictions. And particularly, their security service traditionally have been very much in favor of maintaining relations with Cuba because they work with them on drug trafficking, on migration, and Cuba is a very reliable partner in those areas. So it's contradictory. But then Trump is trying to replace all of his security people as well, so to get yes people. So yeah, that's a bit of the story. I hope that answers your question.
Thanks, Elmi. I should remind people that they can put questions in the chat or raise their hands if they want to ask a question. There are no hands up at the moment, but there's one question in the chat which says, what about, Ian Carty's asked him, what about wind farms?
Wind is also on the agenda. They've done a survey and they found out where they need to site wind turbines and so on. They're even more capital intensive than solar parks. So that's the problem with wind, but they are trying to move ahead on that. I mean, we're working with them on research projects, not only on the technology, battery technology and so on, but also on the whole process of making the transition in terms of how you have to restructure your energy grid and reorganize, who's working on it, because you'll have small companies doing the fitting, doing the maintenance, working with the ministry, with the state companies and so on. So it's quite a complicated picture, but they're definitely moving on it with a lot of energy, as much as they can. But everything you do in Cuba, everything is restricted by not having access to finance.
Great, thank you. Okay, there's no more questions now, so I think all remains to thank you very much though for your presentation and to everyone for the questions.
And thanks very much. Yeah, because and if anybody's got further questions afterwards, my email address is online. Google me.
Great.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks. And I should say we will be discussing it on our executive, because I think, we can't really just do nothing whilst the Americans are putting so much pressure onto Cuba. And I'm sure we can find ways to encourage the Caribbean leaders to maybe do more than they're doing at the moment. And we'll discuss it. And we'll get back to you on this, Emily. Thanks very much again. Okay, our next speaker up is, I can't see him on the screen here. Our next speaker up is Jeremy Corbyn, ex-leader of the Labour Party, longtime campaigner in support of CLS and the work that we do. So I will invite Jeremy to the floor in a minute. I think he needs not much introduction, because he's been an activist on so many fronts for the Caribbean, for every area of the world, Palestine, England, and of course, he's been returned as a popular MP for Islington North. Thank you. Jeremy, can you take the floor?
Yes, thanks, Luke, and thank you very much for inviting me today. And first off, can I say a huge thank you to everyone on the call, many of whom came to Islington in the election campaign in June, July, and showed that it is possible to win an election on a straight radical platform of redistribution of power and wealth in our society, and an end to wars around the world, and less arms spending, and support for refugees. There is an electorate there that's willing and interested in hearing those arguments. And so this is, to me, I think it was a very significant result that we achieved, but it could not have been achieved without the support of so many good comrades on this call, not least you, Luke, for the great work that you did in the campaign. So I want to say thank you very much to everyone for that support. And we are developing our local forum, and Luke has chaired one of them. And we're developing this whole idea of local community forums for political empowerment. I was just listening to what Emily was saying about Cuba, and I want to say thank you to her for the analysis that she put forward. And obviously, the Trump administration coming in will no doubt be full of contradictions, and it's completely unpredictable what Trump will do. And it's probably unpredictable for Trump himself, because he doesn't know what he's going to do yet. But I think we have to maintain our support for Cuba, oppose the isolation and sanctions against Cuba and continue whatever relations we can develop with them and help in any way we can on developing a more sustainable economy in Cuba, but also building relations with the rest of the Caribbean and crucially with Mexico, because Mexico is the nearest country to Cuba in many ways. It's not that far from Merida to Ponte del Rio in Cuba, and we should make sure that there's a good relationship with Mexico. And I'll be going over to Mexico again fairly soon because we have good relations through Peace and Justice Project with the Mexican government, and particularly with the new president, Claudia Sheinbaum, who is very much wanting to develop Mexico's own sustainable economy, but also good relations with the rest of the Caribbean, because she is very well aware of the pitfalls and dangers of the Trump administration. So having said that, I hope that we can ensure that we build those better relations with the rest of the Caribbean countries with Cuba. And it's always struck me as beyond odd that even today, there are relatively few ways of traveling, for example, from Jamaica to Cuba or Jamaica to Haiti, come to that, when they are very near to each other. And as most of you know, I was in Jamaica last month for at the invitation of the University of the West Indies and Brown University. Professor Anthony Bogues invited me to go to Jamaica to deliver a lecture in memory of the late Michael Manley, who was, as you all know, Prime Minister twice in Jamaica and suffered the most appalling attacks upon him, both within the regional, local and global media, but also the economic strangulation that was placed against Jamaica in the 1970s because of his relatively radical government, which was trying to take into public ownership the formerly foreign-owned mining and other industries, but also improve education, health, housing, and all the other issues. And he suffered the worst the CIA can throw at anybody. And as one who remembers those years very well, even though we were very absorbed in fighting what was the incoming Thatcher administration in Britain, I just wonder on reflection if we, and I include myself in this, couldn't and shouldn't have done a lot more to try and support Jamaica at that time. Because I do recall after that, before he was elected for the second term, much later on, Michael Manley came to Britain quite often, and we had a very big public meeting in Tottenham with Bernie Grant, Diane Abbott and myself amongst the speakers there. And Michael was trying to explain the issues of the Caribbean's relative lack of independence in both political and economic sphere. The first because of the lack of independence in economic issues. And so my purpose in going was to link up with people at the UWI, Professor Bogues and many, many others to discuss all these issues. And I wasn't there very long. I've been invited to go again later this year, possibly in April. And if I'm able to, I'd be very happy to go and spend more time there. But a number of impressions came back to me. And one is that ever since Reagan-Thatcher period and the economic attack on the then radical PNP government in Jamaica, we've had 50 years of neoliberal economics being imposed on the people of the Caribbean, and an economic model that is not particularly sustainable, most of it foreign owned, and most of the profits from tourism and other industries do not stay in the Caribbean, or certainly not in Jamaica. They go elsewhere. And these are issues that we obviously, all of us in CLS and other groups, have to address all the time. The burden of my speech was actually to be the opposite, the polar opposite of what David Cameron did when he went on a visit to Jamaica as Prime Minister. I can see people holding their heads in their hands at the very memory of David Cameron's visit to Jamaica. Somebody had obviously whispered in his shell-like before he went, you'll have to say something about reparations because it's bound to come up. And so Cameron obviously spent a luxurious 10-hour flight to Jamaica thinking about all this and came up with the bizarre idea that the one thing Jamaica needed was another prison, and duly told the Jamaican Parliament that Britain was well aware of the need for reparations. There wasn't going to be an apology for slavery, but they were prepared to pay for the building of a new prison. I'm completely unclear whether this prison was ever built or not, or whether Jamaica just pocketed the money, or maybe it never got the money in the first place. I'm sorry to say, completely lost on the outcome of that particular maneuver by Cameron. But I wanted to address the issue of reparations, which I know has been discussed a lot on CLS, and indeed is a growing subject in many areas. And when it was raised at the Commonwealth Heads of Government Conference, the 54 nations there, 50 of them wanted to discuss reparations, 4 didn't. You can pretty easily guess which the 4 were. And so reparations was not discussed. And David Lammy said there was no appetite for this discussion. People wanted to look forward, not backwards, which is not, as I remember, many of the speeches I've listened to of David Lammy in Parliament about reparations in the past, but maybe my ears deceived me at the time. So I wanted to explore those issues. And I think there is really a need for a huge education program about it, because a lot of people simply don't understand what we mean by reparations, and some don't even understand, and these are often well-meaning people, don't understand the principle behind it. I mean, put quite simply, the end of slavery meant massive compensation to the slave owners of then 20 million pounds, which by today's value would be at least 300 million pounds, was paid to slave owners, which was the equivalent at that time of over 40% of all UK government income. So in other words, half of government income, almost half of government income at that time went on paying a very small number of already very wealthy people for their loss of ownership of slaves. The slaves themselves got absolutely nothing in compensation and still haven't. And Jamaica, like every other island in the Caribbean, is left with a legacy of that. And in the case of Haiti, the reparations that were paid to the wealthy in France by the revolutionary so-called government of Napoleon Bonaparte at the time, actually the compensation to them was paid for by Haiti with the massive debt that was imposed on it at the time of the victory over the French forces. And Haiti was born into debt and has never left that debt, and has no prospect of leaving that debt at the moment, is still the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere, and now in a parlous situation beyond belief of essentially criminal gangs at war with each other, and the Kenyan forces supposedly trying to keep the peace there at the present time. So that's the extreme example. So back to Jamaica, you then look at the debt levels that Jamaica has traditionally endured, the increased debt levels that came after the IMF attacks on the Manley government in the 1970s, and then the development of neoliberal economics in Jamaica, particularly by the Seaga government and the JLP government. But the second Manley administration was nothing like as radical as the first Manley administration. That was there were compromises made in order to survive. And Jamaica is having elections this year. And I haven't studied in enormous detail the policies of both the parties, but I did have quite a lot of discussions of people there. And it seems to me Jamaica, like most other Caribbean islands, is not really in a position to offer a huge economic alternative at the present time, because there isn't one being put before the electorate of dealing with the issues of inequality, poverty and injustice. And it is about attracting foreign investment in and giving it an appropriate welcome, which usually means low tax or tax advantages being made to it. That's not to say there aren't a lot of very good people in Jamaica and every other country doing their best to try to challenge this whole principle, which I know, Luke, yourself and many others have been doing. The other interesting news to me is, and having lived for a couple of years in the Caribbean in the 1960s, I remember writing in my diary the day I went to Barbados that I was astonished at the sense of loyalty to Britain, with Union Jacks and pictures of the Queen and goodness knows what all over the place. And I wrote in my diary, this is the last place the monarchy will survive. And now Barbados is the place that has declared itself a republic, and there is a political consensus in Jamaica to move in the same direction, and that, I believe, will happen later this year, which is, I think, interesting and good news. And so on the campaign on reparations, research work has been done by a number of universities, and there are a number of good books been produced on it, not least the work by Dr. Hilary Beckles, the Vice Chancellor of the University of the West Indies, on how Britain underdeveloped the Caribbean, which is an interesting take on the way that Walter Rodney wrote his seminal work on the underdevelopment of Africa. And in that, various figures are placed on the level of reparations that are needed. And so I think we need to do two things. One is to campaign on the principle that the countries that endured slavery in particular, there are other colonies as well, but in particularly those that endured slavery, clearly were never compensated for it, though the slave owners were. Therefore, there has to be a different relationship. It can be a combination of things. First of all, there's the return of artifacts from museums in Britain. That is important for a cultural point and important from a symbolic point. There's also challenging those institutions, such as the Church of England and many British universities, particularly the older ones, such as Glasgow, Oxford, Cambridge, and so on, all of whom benefited from the compensation paid to slave owners, to what they're doing. And Glasgow University, to its credit, has accepted that and has made some payments and has made a difference in that sense. And I say well done Glasgow on this, and well done those that campaigned in Glasgow to achieve that. And I remember Bernie Grant going to Glasgow University and saying exactly that when he was condemned as being mad by most of the British media at the time that he said it. Yet it has happened. And so that is important. But secondly, it's about resetting the relationship, particularly on trade, and the way in which the EU has systematically underpriced or shut out trade from the Caribbean. The Lomé Convention, which was a huge step forward in the 1970s, is now well behind us. And southern countries are becoming once more either suppliers of primary goods to Europe and North America, or looking elsewhere for their development strategy, which includes China, which has its own problems within it. So we need to promote that sort of reset and change. And the other one is straight financial compensation. What levels should Britain be paying as way of compensation to those countries that were so grotesquely exploited by British slavery and slave owners? And so I think first up, it's an education program about history. And during our preparation for the manifesto, particularly 2019 Labour manifesto, Dawn Butler and I had a lot of long discussions about this, and agreed that we would set up an Emancipation Education Trust, which would be well funded and able to go into every school in the country with a program of education on the reality of that history as a way of beginning to reset the understanding of colonial history. Black History Month is a good thing. And I was very pleased when Black History Month was set up. But I think we need to move on from Black History Month into much more challenging on the curriculum that's taught in schools. And there was a recent meeting of the all-party race group in Parliament. It's chaired by Clive Lewis. And we were asked for what our priorities were. And I said my priority was improving primary school history teaching as a way of challenging racism and racist stereotypes, understanding of the rest of the world, and giving primary school children the beginnings of an understanding of a global outlook rather than a purely Eurocentric national outlook. And I strongly believe that this has to be the right way forward. And so I hope we can have a discussion here through CLS and promote this discussion a bit further. And certainly our project, the Project for Peace and Justice, is very happy to work with and support what CLS is doing as a way of promoting that kind of discussion and debate, because it's one that absolutely needs to be heard. I really enjoyed the short visit I had to Jamaica, but a couple of things really shocked me. One was the extent to which the public services are largely privately or contract run, the way in which the European and North American banks basically dominate the finance sector. I was astonished to find that most of Blue Mountain Coffee is owned by Japanese companies now, rather than Jamaican people in the Blue Mountain area. And so I'm looking forward to our discussion and how we can work together in the future. But I'll stop there if I may, Luke. And again, thank you very much for inviting me onto the call today.
Luke, you need to unmute yourself.
Luke, you're muted.
Come on, I'll be talking for 5 minutes to myself. I'm sorry about that. Thank you very much, Jeremy, because you already did a comprehensive talk about what's happening in the region, and including, of course, what's happening in reparations, and that's so important. And I think your belief that teaching history is important in this, I think, is quite important. And maybe I can just give a little bit of a history lesson in that myself, in that just to remind people that when Barney Grant, the first MP to raise a question really about reparations in Parliament, you were one of the MPs that supported him, along with Tony Benn and 50 others, I think, at the time, Labour MPs. I think we'll be struggling to find 3 of them in the Labour Party at the moment. It's being so denuded of any left wing by the present leader. But I also noticed that we've got Anthony Gifford here with us. Tony Gifford,
brilliant.
who was the first to actually raise a question in the House of Lords. And Tony, I'd like to give you the opportunity to maybe say something, because you also produced a document about a legal case for reparations. I want to expect you to expand on that at the moment, but please, can you just come in and say a few words? You need to unmute before. You're still muted, Tony. Tony was one of the first who's been involved with reparations movement, and a great friend of Barney Grant. He visited.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you. Okay, come in, please.
Well, first of all, Jeremy, wonderful to see you. I'm sorry we haven't been together since your victory, but I've been following what's been going on, and I heard some of the arguments you just made, which are going to be very important in the reparations campaign. I'm still a kind of a now non-resident member of the National Council of Reparations in Jamaica, And there's been a very active group of people who have put together the arguments very well. I think there's more to be done in mobilizing the people. I want to take a slightly different view of what happened recently in Samoa at the end of October. You remember that the Prime Minister Starmer gave a really rude brush off to the journalists who asked him when he arrived whether he was going to allow reparations to be on the agenda. And he said, the UK do not do reparations. And I was very excited a couple of days later to read the statement of the head of the government, which said this. It talked about the discussions on reparations and the history, and said the heads of government agreed that the time has come for a meaningful, truthful, and respectful conversation towards forging a common future based on equity. Now that is the first time, so far as I'm aware, that any British leader, head of government, has agreed, has had to agree, been forced to agree, by the sheer moral and historical weight of the subject, to take part to come to the table. And I think it is up to us to help the cause by doing some more work than has been done so far on what reparations really means. I think that the legal case, the historical case, and the moral case have been made to all right-thinking people, and the Commonwealth vote was evidence of that. But when you try to ask, what does it actually mean in practice? What's the program? Not enough work has been done. The CARICOM have produced a 10-point plan, which is worth reading, because it identifies 10 areas where the effects of enslavement still are felt very severely. But they still don't go much further than that to say how much and when. And it seems to me that Jeremy hit the right note when he referred to the £20 million paid to the owners of the enslaved, because that is the emotional and tragic link between this cause and what happened in history. And I think that rather than just say we want more money, so that we want more aid, because reparations is not aid, I think it is time that we take part in a big consultation to think about what reparations means. And one of the slogans might be, we want 20 million, small type with interest.
Good. Thank you so much, Tony. Thank you very much for that. I'll open the floor to questions now. And there are a few hands up. We've got Joseph Antoine, and then Paul Ward, and then Stephen Howard. So we take those three first, and then we'll come to the audience.
Yeah, good afternoon, Luke, and good afternoon, the other speakers. Particularly, Jeremy, is always a breath of fresh air listening to you and seeing you speak. You mentioned about education at the primary level and Jamaica in Britain. But I think we need that also in the Caribbean. Not necessarily the same what you would teach in England, because we have had a situation in Grenada, for instance, where history was not taught since invasion. And it's only the last year or so it was reintroduced. And I'm asking the question also, do you think that the Caribbean in particular lost the opportunity to put reparation on the agenda firmly during the first decade of people of African ancestry? And what do you think we can do going forward in the second decade of people of African ancestry? Thank you very much.
Thank you. We'll take one other question. Joseph?
No, I speak already.
Oh, sorry, I'm looking at the wrong screen. Paul Ward, you're up next. Can you unmute? Paul, you need to unmute.
Yeah, thanks. On the history question, interesting that what you said, Jeremy, about needing schools in Britain, Europe, whatever. But very much so here. You probably realize that the reparations isn't really part of the national debate going on in Jamaica at the moment. And I don't think it ever has, as far as I'm concerned, not amongst ordinary folks. Our local primary school here in Jamaica doesn't even have a history department. They have social studies, they don't even teach history. So I think there's a whole lot more can be done in Jamaica and probably the rest of the Caribbean in terms of history, so people can feel they have a right to demand more. A very unhistorical, unpolitical kind of basis of education here, as much as elsewhere, I think, I'm afraid to say. Two other quick points. One, I'm very glad you mentioned a change of some trade regime, because even though monetary compensation as part of reparations is surely important, and playing around and helping with different social services may help. I think unless we change trade, any kind of reparations will be a benefit kind of short-lived. In a bit like Malcolm Manley's call in the 70s for a new international economic order. To me, that has to be part of reparations. Without that, it really doesn't work. And the last thing I'll just mention is I've just been reading an article, long article by Hilborn Watson at a conference in the Netherlands, the political economy of reparations. And he's a Marxist, as you probably know, but he's very pessimistic about what reparations might achieve in the immediate future, basically arguing that the economic strength of countries like in the Caribbean are so weak, and we're still so dependent on EU for help, that to actually stand up in demand rather than be a supplicant is very hard to do. And without it, we may not achieve very much.
Good. Thank you, Paul. I'll take one more question for now, and then we'll, Jeremy, you'll come in and maybe, speak. Stephen Howard.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. A safe, prosperous, and happy 2025 and beyond to everyone. Mr. Corbyn, I don't know if you're the same Jeremy Corbyn that used to be interviewed by Samori Marksman and Amy Goodman about 25, 30 years ago by Pacifica Radio's WBAI. But when I hear people talking about reparations, and they're talking about millions of dollars, I see that as a deposit to each nation impacted by the African transatlantic slave trade. One of the things that I would demand is forgiveness of debt by all African, Caribbean, Latin American, South American nations who were exploited through slavery, Brazil being one of the largest nations. What I would also suggest or demand is free education for everyone in the African diaspora, free insurance, and that be just a deposit for what these superpowers owe us. I'll wrap up with this. Look at what Haiti went through by having to pay France for the loss of income with their liberation. Anytime anybody's talking about millions of dollars, like I said, that should be a deposit to every African nation impacted by the enslavement of its people. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Okay, Jeremy, do you want to take? Jeremy, do you want to come in and respond to any of those comments or questions? Is Jeremy still with us?
He's got to unmute. Jeremy, you've got to unmute.
Is that okay? Can you hear me now?
Yes, that's
Oh,
good.
good. Oh, thanks, Luke. Sorry, I hadn't unmuted and I thought I had. First of all, thanks for the questions, and great to see Tony on the call. And I'm sorry we didn't get a chance to catch up when I was there, but hopefully on my next visit we can meet up and have a longer discussion, and also go into some of the more detailed points that you've been putting. And also the point that was being made by Paul about education in Jamaica as well as here is, I think, very well put and very well made. I went to visit Kingston College when I was there, partly because I once taught there many, many years ago. And they interviewed me for a video for the school to be shown to the students. And they asked me what it was like when I taught there in the 1960s and how that compared with my impressions of the day I was there. And I described the place and the experience and so on, which was fine. And then I said, one thing that really hit me then was the enormous class sizes. And I found it very difficult as a young person to teach mixed ability classes of 45 students. And they looked at me and said, well, we still got classes of 45 students. Nothing has changed, which seemed to me when we are complaining when class sizes in Britain go above 30, and quite rightly so. Jamaica has a normality of that, and therefore difficulty in education achievements for fairly obvious reasons. And so there is the question of money for education and health and all the other services. But the other point that you made, Paul, which is a crucial one really, is that financial compensation, as Stephen was putting it, as a sort of down payment for the theft of wealth through the slave trade and the destruction of so many lives in the brutality of the slave trade, doesn't mean anything unless you actually change the trade and economic relationship between the Caribbean, West Africa, particularly West Africa, and Europe, in particular Britain, because you'd soon be back to the same situation. So the arguments for debt forgiveness are absolutely huge. The debts that grew very rapidly in the 1970s were largely because of the very steep rise in oil prices at that time, and then the IMF's obsession with structural adjustment programs, which was essentially global privatization being promoted by them, would all come back again unless you actually empower the producer countries in a way that they've never been empowered before. So there has to be a serious look at the question of the trade relations, the tariff barriers that are being imposed, and of course the approach of the new Trump administration, which essentially is, as I see it, to lock out large amounts of trade from elsewhere, that anything that could be seen as competitive to US producers. Now that will have an interesting series of effects on the Caribbean and in particular on Mexico, some of which may end up with completely different political and trade alignments around the world, with China and the BRICS countries becoming far more important at the expense of the US and Europe, particularly if the BRICS countries develop their own currency relationship in the future. And so I think that's an area we need to think about and look at in a lot more detail. On the question of forgiveness of debt, I absolutely understand that point and support it, because the debt forgiveness issue is a fairly crucial one. And if you look at the growing proportion of the expenditure of many African and Caribbean countries on paying an increasing level of debt, where they have no control over the way the debt was incurred in the first place, no control over the interest payments, and very little control about what they can do economically to raise the funds to pay the debt. And so the indebtedness gets worse and worse. The power of the diaspora communities is something that I think many of us politically often underestimate. If you look around the world at the moment, the power of often quite small diaspora communities to influence politics in their own country, look at what the Palestinian diaspora has achieved in not huge numbers all across Latin America. There are Palestinian communities, particularly in Chile, but also Argentina, Brazil, Colombia, Venezuela, and so on, in pretty well every country in Latin America. And they are the children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren of those that suffered the Nakba in 1948. They have made huge effort to influence the governments of their own countries into being a powerful voice in support of Palestine and Palestinian rights. And I think we should take our hat off to them and admire them for what they've achieved, obviously at the same time expressing our solidarity with the Palestinian people. Maybe a campaign about justice for the Caribbean and justice for Africa within the diaspora communities is something that could take off and could be better understood. And by promoting that education through supplementary education and all the other means at our disposal, as well as maximum use of Black History Month on this, we'll begin to have that influence on our own education system and therefore on the whole arguments for reparations. But as I think it was Tony was saying, the bald figure is quite simply this, that £300 million was paid to slave owners, which took until 2015 to pay it off. Nothing was ever paid to any slave or any descendant of any slave. And the compensation that the French slave owners received was actually paid by the people of Haiti and is still being paid by the people of Haiti. So it's basically a simple question of historical injustice that we have to address. So maybe at a future meeting, Luke, we could look in more detail at the trade relationships and also what strategy the incoming Trump administration is likely to take as we go forward into what could be some very difficult years with the Trump administration. I think I'll stop there because there may be some other questions you want to raise.
Yes, there's a few more questions. Thanks very much for that. And I must say, one of the plans we've got is to try and hold a face-to-face meeting on reparations in the UK in this new year. So you'll hear from us on that. Okay, I've got three hands up. Jovan, good to see you. You want to take the floor if you unmute first, and then after you, it's Patrick, and then Frank Murray.
Cool. Thank you.
Three questions in a row.
Cool.
Hey.
Nice to see you and Happy New Year to everybody. I guess my question originates in the first part of your point, Jeremy, where we've kind of got a Labour movement, a Labour Party that sees some of the things that we're advocating for as fundamentally illegitimate. I've been doing some stuff with Jackie McKenzie and others on reparations and campaigns with the British Museum to ensure that there's actually a legacy to enslavement of African people in the Caribbean. How, I guess, would be my question to you as someone who's still a party member and is still active in the Labour Party, how can we kind of hold our heads high and try and utilise what institution we have left to advocate some of these things when it's liable to more woke wars, when we've got characters now in Parliament who are fundamentally denigrating some of the things that we're advocating for. I stood at the last election against one of them who is an arch racist and everything else. My question, I guess, to you is just more, how do we displace some of the hostilities that have been presented to our cause, particularly when Parliament has fundamentally changed and some of the people in it are trying to undermine what we're advocating for? Thank you.
Thank you. Patrick Scott, here next up. If you unmute, you can put your question to Mr. Corbyn. Here we go.
This is just a brief observation, and just say to Jeremy, congratulations on getting elected. I live in Islington and I campaigned for you, but I couldn't vote for you because I had the misfortune to live in Emily Thornberry's constituency. But just one thing I'd like to raise is, I mean, people should be aware that only I think a year ago or a couple of years ago, the government in Zimbabwe announced it was going to pay out compensation to former white farmers whose lands have been and farms have been expropriated under the Mugabe regime. So the compensation or reparations to people who actually materially benefited from white racism, it didn't end in the 19th century. It's something that continues well into this century, as the example of Zimbabwe shows. So that's just the point I was trying to make.
Okay, thank you, Patrick. Next we'll have Frank Murray up when he's unmuted for your question to Jeremy Corbyn. And before you speak though, Frank, before you speak, thanks for your question, Patrick. Frank Murray, are you there?
Yeah.
Your hand is up. Oh, good. Okay. Before you put your question, because I've called your name so many times at the beginning of the meeting and saying that you might chair the meeting when you appear, but here you appear now. I think it's no point now. But
Yeah,
please, what's the question?
I didn't appear because I was having internet problems.
Okay, that's all.
Anyway, yeah, what I was gonna, my contribution would be that there was an internet study with the AI, ChatGPT, and the question of reparation was asked and taken into consideration various things, and they found that the money that would actually pay towards reparation would be 500,000 trillion, which they took into consideration the enslavement of people and also the position of Africa, what position Africa would have been in had they not been, colonized, brutalized, etc. And taking into consideration again the developments they had at the time in methodology, in medical, in economics at the time. If they were left to develop the way they should have developed naturally, according to them, it would be 5,000 trillion dollars.
How many knots is that, Frank?
I don't know, but it seems to me like it to me that is the kind of money that we be looking at, because Africa would have been in a totally different stage. Who knows? And instead of being barbarized or being colonized by barbarians, and we're the stage we're at present. So that's a contribution. I don't know how that would be helpful.
Okay, thanks.
Top of my head, that's something like 21 zeros.
Thanks, Stephen. Okay, we'll take one more question from Ozzy, and then we'll come back to you, Jeremy. Ozzy, you want to unmute and put your question?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, sure. Thanks a lot. And yeah, excellent talk, Jeremy. I really enjoyed it. I guess I just have a simple question. I would like to hear your thoughts on the idea of reparations being a possible catalyst to fundamentally transform the existing system of production and this deep focus on capital accumulation. Like, can it be transformative? Is it possible for it to be transformative?
Okay, thank you. I'll save you for last, Liz, if you don't mind. Let's take, if Jeremy, if you want to come in with those three questions. You want to reply or comment?
Yeah, thanks, Luke. I'll come in now then on those. Thanks very much. On the last point that Ozzy made, and the other questions as well, reparations is not just about the money. It's also about the cultural relationship. It's also about the... Sorry, I've seen my camera's gone off. There you are, that's better. You can see me in glorious Technicolor. Sorry, I didn't realize it had gone off. It's not just about money. It's also about cultural relationship. It's also about trade relationship. It's also about investment in the countries concerned. And when you say transformative, that is important, because if you think about the nature of production in most countries in West Africa and pretty well all countries in the Caribbean, they're essentially either recipients of income from tourism, much of which doesn't stay in the country anyway, the income, or they are producers of primary goods, unprocessed and exported elsewhere, either minerals or primary agricultural products. There is very little secondary or tertiary production done in any of those countries. So a reparations program that involved investment in processing of primary agricultural products, involved industrial development. And I know this is something the first Michael Manley government was very keen to try and do, particularly where bauxite was concerned in Jamaica, but there are other examples of that. That's an area one could think about, and also developing CARICOM as a Caribbean market, which could also promote the development of manufacturing and secondary and tertiary production, I think is something that is very important. Also, we need to recognize that the injustice that was done in Haiti and has been done to the Caribbean and West Africa is actually being repeated in the demands of the West that the Zimbabwe landowners be compensated for their loss of land because of the land reforms that were introduced in Zimbabwe. Now, I remember going to Zimbabwe in about 1990. My late brother lived there at the time, and I met a lot of these Rhodesian, Rhodesian farmers and so on, who were clever and careful in what they said. But basically, their whole strategy was to hang on to the ownership of the land as best they could against any attempt by the government to take over their land and pass it on to other people. Then the demands of the world economy on Zimbabwe were absolutely huge, and demanded that these people be actually compensated for land that was stolen from the African people from 1890 onwards. It wasn't as if the formation of Northern Rhodesia was a long distant colonial past. It wasn't. It was only 140 years ago that Fort Salisbury was established and grew from there. That was the whole Rhodes legacy, was that. And even they are getting compensation for their alleged loss of land that they probably had no right to in the first place. And so I do think there has to be some fairly simple and robust discussions taking place. Now, do these discussions take place in Parliament or not? Well, generally speaking, Parliament does not want to discuss nature of colonialism or colonial heritage. They're usually quite happy to have an annual debate on Black History Month, where a number of us contribute or try to bring up the question of reparations and cultural improvement and education and so on. But it needs to go a lot further. In the Labour Party under Starmer, all these debates have gone a long way backwards. There haven't been those kind of discussions, there haven't been those kind of debates, and there haven't been speakers from different parts of the world speaking at Labour Party conference. It's now a depressingly Atlanticist setup with speakers from Europe and North America and nothing else. And I remember arguing with Labour officials when I insisted on having a speaker on behalf of the Chagos Islands, for example, when I was leader of the party. They just simply didn't want to discuss the issue because it was all too complicated and too uncomfortable. Well, we're not here to make life comfortable and easy for people who are in public positions. So I do think a strategy of education on reparations, of analysis, which a great deal, a fantastic amount of work has been done and is being done, and then demands on particular British institutions. On my bookshelf just over there, I've got an awful lot of books in this study. Most of them are double banked on the bookcases. I've got that incredible book called British Museum, which is about the history of the British Museum and where it got all its artifacts from. And so whilst the return of artifacts is not the be all and end all of reparations. It's a very small part of it, but it has a huge symbolism surrounding it, and that is why it's important to make those demands and make those demands on it. And so I think we have a lot of very important work to do on this, on trade, on investment, on culture, and above all, in the longer term, on history teaching in our schools, and also encouraging the same kind of history teaching in the Caribbean. I mean, there used to be the idea of education for global understanding, which was the idea you'd have some kind of core subjects taught all over the world. These are by some people in the UN, where you at least begin to give students all over the world some sense of global understanding. That, to me, maybe I wouldn't call it a global curriculum. I think that would be going a bit far, but at least pressurize in some way to a better sense of understanding of what European expansion and so on meant. And the way I always put it to the schools that I go to is that your learning and what you understand in chemistry, in physics, in maths, in literature comes from Europe, yes, comes from North America, comes from Latin America, comes from Africa, comes from South Asia, comes from China. A little bit of everything we know and everything we consume comes from somewhere else in the world. It's up to us to understand that, and that might in turn reduce the ghastly attitudes towards asylum seekers and refugees that have become so common in our media and, unfortunately, in the debate in Parliament. And I don't want to depress you, Joseph, but the most depressing thing I had in Parliament recently was I was just almost in disbelief, staring at the front bench of the government, the front bench of the opposition, and the Liberal Democrats and so on, all vying with each other about who would be the most brutal in stopping people arriving in small boats from Calais. Nobody is defending people traffickers, but surely there has to be a humanitarian defense of people who are victims of war, environmental disaster, and so much else, who end up in a desperate situation where they're prepared to risk their lives to get out of the hell of camps in Calais, where they're being harassed by the police and the far right in equal measure. Surely they're human beings that deserve our sympathy and our support, not our abuse, which is what they get for the most part from the British political establishment. I'll stop there, Luke, otherwise I'll go on too long and you'll tell me off.
Luke, you're either on mute or you're gone.
Oh, damn. I didn't realize my camera. Who took my camera off? Sorry, I'm here. I didn't realize my camera was on or unmuted. Thanks, Jeremy, for answering those two. We'll have two final questions. We'll have Dr. Liz Enobong. I hope I've pronounced your name right, and correct me if I haven't there. And then we'll have New Things. So please, Dr. Liz, would you come in?
Yeah, thank you very much, Luke, for letting me speak again. Thank you so much, Jeremy.
How did I do on this surname? Tell me.
So it's Inabong. Inabong is my given name, which means God's first gift. I hope I'm a gift to you too. Elizabeth was the name that the previous monarch gave me. But anyway, so when that one went, I made sure I put back my African name. So Jeremy and I, you know, we hung out together in Parliament the other day. Global African Congress held a lobby of Parliament at the end of December, and it was we were very well lucky to have Jeremy and John McDonnell come and join us in the debate. The debate was also hybrid like this one. And
yes, and thanks very much for the invite. I'm sorry I had to miss that one.
No, it's okay, because it's part of it, as Jeremy sort of like pointed out at the end there, it's part of a discussion about reparations that we all need to be involved in across CARICOM, across the African Union, and across the what he's referring to as the diaspora, but I refer to the diaspora as all people of what we used to call African descent, but Global African Congress calls us Africans. We're Africans, whether we're on the continent, in the Caribbean, in the Latin Americas, or in Britain and Europe. So we're all impacted by what happened, and we're still impacted by what's happening in terms of racism, its impact on our health, well-being, education system, etc., across the globe. And when we talk about reparations, we, from a globalist perspective, don't want to just talk about money. We want to talk about the impacts that the foreign companies are still perpetuating in Africa and the Caribbean in terms of human resources, us as Caribbeans being forced into work that isn't beneficial to the islands or to the people, i.e. tourism solely and nothing else, and not growing our own and not building our own and not educating our own. And in Africa, where again, these IMF loans are restricting what we can grow and what we can use. And in the French and the Francophone countries, how much it costs for the gold that we dig up, or if we can even sell it, for example. So when we finally get to the stage where we can start talking about the reparations part, because we need to think about first the political impact of continuing colonialism in Africa and the Caribbean, continuing with these multinationals. We need to have the multinationals, leave the continent, but if they want to stay, that's fine, but we must take all of their profits because they're using all of our resources. For example, the Sahel, we know that Niger has very few people with electricity, but Niger uranium is making sure that everyone in France has electricity, including the French Africans that are living there. So we in the diaspora are benefiting still from what the Africans aren't benefiting from, their own resources. So I've put a questionnaire in the chat where we can all discuss and continue to debate what our idea of reparations is. But when we get the international community to recognise that they've done us wrong and that reparations is due, it's not up to them or anybody else besides the African countries and the Caribbean who are given the money as to what we do with that money. We can't say we need to have certain trade embargoes or certain trading structures. We need, if you steal money from me, Luke, and I get it back, you can't say yes, but you can't spend it on drink, because I'm going to have that bottle of Prosecco. It's nothing to do with you. We need to be re-empowered with our ability to control our countries, our resources, and our people, because people are our resources, and they wouldn't need to get on these small boats if we had reparations. So that is something that we should be taking back to this British government, the American government coming, and internationally. And I just feel that we need to, next year, we're going back to Parliament as Global African Congress, but we're also going to have a round table, and there's the all-party parliamentary group on reparations that Bel Ribiradi, MP for my locality, is hosting. But we have to get involved as activists and as accomplice, as I would say most of our trade union colleagues in this chat are. We need to get involved in making sure that when we get the reparations, it repairs the damage done, and it allows the African peoples to decide what they do with the money when they get it, if we get money.
Great, thank you. Because of time.
Yeah.
Just stop it there, and we will consider that. Now, one new thing, if you unmute, you can put your question to Jeremy Corbyn.
Yeah, I'm not chipping out quite frequently, but I hope you can hear me. I'd just like to say greetings to the room.
Yes.
and greetings to Jeremy, and I'm really, really honoured to be here, you know, with all of you. I just would like to also say kudos to the fact that you've had such longevity, Jeremy, in terms of being able to, you know, last so long while you've been, you know, the struggle's been that great, in terms of your, the fight that you've been getting. But, right, so my question is, so you mentioned when Cameron went to Jamaica and he was, the thought that he had was to basically give Jamaica a prison. In terms of what's going on regarding the global setup that I see happening with these 15-minute cities that are going to emerge, and the basic universal economic basic income, and digital currency, I would just like your thoughts on how you see us as basically people that are from the diaspora, you know, African descendants that have like basically suffered at the hands of what I would call institutional racism, for the want of a better term. But how would this money, if we were granted it, be given to us? Would it be in the form of digital currency? And if it was, you know, owing to the fact that this digital currency cannot be saved, it's programmable, it will not allow you to set, you know, basically save. So how would this pan out for us? You know, how I'm not sure if I'm explaining it properly, but like, what would the AI featured incorporation into, like, what's going on in regards of the like plan that they have for 2030 and beyond, where we got like, say, this mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, who wants to basically charge people to pay per mile in terms of driving. How would this impact us?
We lost.
Yeah, I'm not sure how that's going to pan out, and I understand the fight and how real it is, but my point was, how will we incorporate the digital currency into us getting reparations? Will it be the same, or will it be something that, like, because as I see it, they have a whole set of different plans for us going forward. So I don't understand. It's not like before when, you know, money, this currency that we use, using cash for argument's sake, could you know, just be easily spent. This is going to be something that's going to basically track our every transaction, or find a way to sort of like entrap us. That's why I mentioned the prison with David Cameron, because I feel like it's like a bigger prison that they're slowly trying to incorporate us into in the coming future. And I would just like your thoughts on that, if possible.
Okay, thank you. Jeremy, you want to come in and wrap up?
Yeah, very briefly. Thanks, Luke. On the last point, the reparations issue comes essentially in three ways. One is recognition of the injustice created in the public mind, and that is not really there at the moment. It's there amongst us on this call for sure, and it's there amongst quite a lot of people in the communities, but not everybody. And so there is a sort of education work to be done, a huge education work to be done, which is why I place so much emphasis on education. The second is the issue of financial compensation, and that has to be done in a way that makes sure it gets to the people who deserve it, and it doesn't get swallowed up somewhere else. Hence the issue of debt forgiveness is part of it. And the third, which is really more fundamental for the long term, is the economic relationship that exists between the industrialized, largely North, and African and Caribbean countries. And unless that economic relationship is reset in some way, then the continual underpayment of producers for the primary products they produce, the agricultural as well as the mineral production, then you'll be back into exactly the same level of indebtedness at some point in the future. It is that question of assertiveness of it. The interesting thing is the 1970s, the oil producing countries got together and set up OPEC, which fundamentally changed their relationship with the consuming countries, which were at that time largely Europe and North America. It's changed a bit since then because China wasn't at that time such an enormous consumer of oil as it is now. But the same thing did not happen with most other primary products. For example, coffee producers inevitably tend to be in places where there's warm weather and mountains for obvious reasons, because that's where coffee grows. It doesn't grow at all in Europe or in North America, yet they're both enormous importers of coffee. Coffee prices are set in London at the World Coffee Exchange, for example, and there are plenty of other tea and other products as well that are set in the same way. So it is a question of reconfiguring the trade relationships and the pricing arrangements that exist towards producer countries. And the point that was made first about the Global African Congress, and thanks very much for what you said there. It was great to be at that meeting in Parliament, and I'm pleased you're holding more of them. And that, again, is a way of educating people far more. So I think we need more of these discussions, more of these debates, and above all, more of the very interesting and very detailed research has been done, particularly by UWI and some of the black universities in the United States and to some extent in this country, so that it becomes a subject that is much wider and much better understood. When Bernie raised these issues all those years ago in Parliament, I remember Blair and company just didn't really know which way to look or what to say or what to do. And it was a very small number of us that were able to support Bernie in the statements he was making. Because I remember him coming to me beforehand saying he was preparing to make this speech in Parliament and would we all be sure to be there to support him? And obviously we were. And so it is about that. And I think this afternoon's discussion has been really interesting, and I'm very grateful to you, Luke, and others for inviting me onto it. And I'm very pleased to have been able to come. And again, thanks very much for all the support that you gave in the election. It certainly changed the atmosphere around here, and we now have we have a very positive political atmosphere in our community as a result of that election. Thank you very much.
Yeah, no, I should be thanking you. Thank you very much, Jeremy. I'll be thanking all the speakers. Thanks, Jeremy, because you've always supported CLS. I know you for probably a good 40 years. It's somewhere I won't give away your age, but we've been around for a while. We've stomped a lot of streets together, and certainly was a very electric campaign in your borough, and it was really great to see the way your constituents loved you. As I mentioned at that one meeting you had, if I had a pound for every time somebody said how much they love Jeremy and what he's done for them, I would have had a holiday somewhere. So thank you very much again for coming and speaking on our platform. Emily, thanks very much to you too for your really wonderful presentation on Cuba. And it's really triggered so many things we need to be doing for Cuba still. And we'll definitely be discussing it on the executive or next executive meeting to see what action we can take or what was our next move on Cuba. Reparations is always on our agenda, and we hope to have several meetings on this issue. It's not going away, and education, as everybody has said, is a key part of it. So we intend to keep trying to educate as many people as possible. Some trade union leaders were on the meeting and the conference. Thanks to Kevin for inviting me up to his constituents to speak to a group up there. We look forward to doing some more of that. Ozzy, thanks for your report on Trinidad. Keeping an eye on that one, and definitely we will be supporting any action that you're proposing. And to all the people who have attended the meeting, who have contributed, and thank you all so much. Our next meeting, we look forward to seeing you. So yes, so once more, a clap cheer for everybody. Thank you very much. And thanks to all the speakers, and thanks to people visiting us. Thank you. Meeting's finished now.
Happy New Year, everyone.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you,
everyone.
everyone.